President-elect Donald Trump hasn't been sworn in just yet, but is already making bold threats about acquiring more land for America, and that includes Canada. Now, to dive deeper into what presidential powers Trump actually has, let's bring in U.S. constitutional law expert Joshua Kasteberg. Joshua, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me on.
All right, so Trump may or may not be serious when he talks about his imperialist designs, but these are threats nonetheless, and it's ones that Canadians are taking seriously. So when Trump takes office, what tools will he have if he were to seriously try to take over another country?
Well, there are a number of restraints on the president that make his claims unrealistic, and then there are some worry points. The restraints on the president, the constitutional restraints on the president are very clear. The United States cannot add territory without the approval of Congress. The Supreme Court decided that issue in the mid-19th century. The president may be commander-in-chief, but the Constitution specifically assigns to the Congress of the United States the authority to add lands. Now, creating Canada to a 51st state seems to me to be just a fanciful rhetoric and an impossibility, because it would take two things. One, the will of the Canadian people themselves, and that's governed by the Canadian Constitution and law. I have significant doubts that would ever get any traction in a sovereign country such as yours. But the second constraint, which is our Constitution in the United States, is that the president has no role whatsoever in statehood. For a new state to come into being, that is purely reserved for the Congress of the United States to do. The Congress sets the conditions and makes the approval. Now, there have been two instances in history where a president has been involved directly, but that's because Congress passed an enabling statute for that to happen. And that has to do with my state, New Mexico, and Arizona, that both came into the United States in 1912 from being territories. So under our principal document, the Constitution of the United States, he basically has no role. Now, as a commander-in-chief, as any student of world history will know, presidents have sent military forces around the world without asking Congress for permission first. There's something called the War Powers Act that every president since Nixon tried to veto it to the president, to President Trump, has claimed is unconstitutional. But Congress holds the funding key, and they can cut off funding for military operations. That happened to Nixon in regard to military operations in Cambodia. So I wouldn't take his rhetoric seriously on trying to conquer or bring Canada in. But what I would take seriously is his threat to issue tariffs, because under the Constitution, he has far more leverage in foreign economic policy than he does in terms of, acquiring land for the United States and then becoming sort of a Caesar of the world. So that is a worrisome point. And Congress doesn't have the check on the president in terms of economic policy that they do in terms of, acquiring new territory.
Well, Joshua, there are concerns about Trump maybe changing the Constitution or bending rules and regulations to benefit himself once in office. So
Yeah.
in regards to using military force or economic force to take over Canada, military force to take over the Panama Canal or Greenland, how feasible would that be? Would he be able to change the Constitution when he's in power?
Well, well, it's not so much to me changing the Constitution, it's violating the Constitution, but not being held to account. And that was made easier by the Supreme Court this summer in Trump versus United States. I mean, they issued in a 5-4 decision a very controversial ruling on what the criminal liabilities are for a sitting president in terms of presidential acts. And the use of military force will invariably be considered to be a presidential act. So the real constraint on Trump is a matter of the popular will of the American people and the Congress of the United States. And I can't be a gauge on what a Republican-led Congress will do to check the president in that arena. So I think that's a great question that you've asked. It's a concern that's worth highlighting because it's a very real concern. But again, it's not changing our Constitution, it's violating it. That's the concern.
All right. Well, Joshua, your insights, as always, very interesting. We appreciate your time today. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for having me on.
That is U.S. constitutional law expert and historian Joshua Kastenberg.